Good morning. We're going to take a look at what exactly is going to happen in this adolescent literature class throughout the course of the semester. And I think we have to begin by trying to define what exactly adolescent literature is. In some ways, I think adolescent literature might even be a dated term. We could probably be talking about young adult novels. Either way, it's a marketing term, I think, as much as it is an actual definition of a specific genre. Literature, I think, is fairly easy to define. It's the works of the imagination. It includes novels, it includes stories, it includes poetry. That's pretty easy to define. We've had literature since the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we probably had literature even well before that. Adolescent, however, is a little bit more difficult to define. Adolescent is a person aged 12 to 19. We can even extend that perhaps to age 26 as more people are living at home. The government recognizes age 26 to be eligible on insurance. And I think adolescent might be something more about the circumstance or the behavior than it is about age. And as I said with young adult novels, it might be something that is as much about the marketing as it is about the actual adolescent. I would also add that adolescent is something that came into vogue in perhaps the 19-teens or 1920s. Prior to that, people age 12, age 14, age 10 were miniature adults, and we didn't worry about pushing them to school. We worried about, could they work? Could they help on the farm? Could they earn some money in a coal mine? And so I think adolescent is part of the growth of the economy that allowed more and more people to go to school. Finally, as we go through this intro, I think it's important to understand that adolescent literature, young adult literature, is an American invention. It's an American phenomenon. I hope it's more nutritious than a hot dog. I don't know if it rises to the level of jazz, because jazz, I think, is one of the ultimate American art forms. But I do think it's important to understand that American literature, or that young adult literature, adolescent literature, is something that Americans have created and developed. I want to begin with the Nancy Drew story. Nancy Drew is important because of the women around the picture here. You have Supreme Court justices, you have secretaries of state, you have first ladies, you have women of substance and power who all claim that Nancy Drew was an important element in their development of their identities. And so it seems to me that even though there may well have been novels that began before Nancy Drew, that this detective novel, this novel of this young woman solving mysteries, is a key novel in the development of adolescent literature, in the development of young adult fiction. However, it also points out some of the problems with adolescent literature. One of them is a lot of people look down on it. Mental laziness, intellectual torpor. It doesn't challenge. Second of all, adolescent literature, like a lot of popular literatures, have this urge to be relevant. Okay? A book written in 1930 didn't seem relevant in the 1960s. The political riots around the 1968 Democratic Convention certainly weren't something anticipated in 1930. The use of drugs, the sexual revolution that occurred in the 1960s, those were not something anticipated in 1930, especially given that the Depression was just starting. And so we have the situation of something being a formula that worked for a long time, being criticized because it was a formula, but then we also have this thing that is no longer relative. So in the 1960s, we got books like The Outsiders. The Outsiders dealt with violence. The Outsiders dealt with poverty. The Outsiders dealt with the world of the 1960s. Outsiders doesn't deal with the pandemic of 2020. So you start understanding that in the effort to be relevant, things are going to change. And in the effort to be relevant, Just like Nancy Drew became a formula, the problem novel became a formula. And it didn't focus on a character or a recurring character. It focused on drug abuse or teen pregnancy or something else like that, so that people focused on the social condition and not the quality of the novel. And the problem novel eventually became a soap opera. And once it became a soap opera, it gave way to other TV tropes, other TV genres, romance and horror. And they were predictable and they were cardboard and they allowed a certain amount of safety. They were very, very popular. Sweet Valley High, Goosebumps sold hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of books throughout the course of their runs. But it wasn't the same as some of the original high quality stuff of the 1960s, for example, like The Outsiders. And it just became sort of a downward slope into formula hell. And eventually you got a return. Harry Potter was recognized as being far better literature, and the Harry Potter series was used archetypes and seemed to be something that was taught in college classrooms very quickly. Eventually, the idea of using a magical world gave us Twilight with the werewolves and the vampires. It also gave us that weird 50 Shades of Grey fan fiction thing. And then we went to the dystopia of the Hunger Games, and we all of a sudden went into the formulas of dystopia with Divergent, and we went back into formula hell. I'm guessing that eventually we're going to go through formula hell again and again and again as we deal with young adult fiction. So, what I want to talk about is ways to find quality young adult fiction and to look at the qualities that make something good young adult fiction. First of all, it's written for a teen audience and it is written about teens. More importantly, it's written in a teen voice. One of my favorite novels is Ordinary Grace. It is written about teens. I think it's accessible to a teen audience, but it is not written in a teen voice. It is written by an older man looking back at his life as a teenager during an important, turbulent summer in his life. Number 4, I think shaping identity. How do I become this person I want to become is a key element. How do I start taking control of some of the things in my life is a key theme, a key element of all of these novels. And again, that wasn't the key to Ordinary Grace. Finally, it's didactic. In other words, it's going to teach. It might even hammer you over the head with the idea of this is the point I'm trying to make. I think that theme is oftentimes an observation. It's more of a complete sentence rather than the moral of the story. We'll get into that as we go along. But I think these characteristics are what we're going to look at. In this class, I want to look at character. Who are these people, the protagonists? I want to look at the conflict a little bit less, but all novels are driven by conflict, so I think we have to look at that. Connections are key. How does this novel connect to other novels? How does this novel connect to the real world we're living in? How does this novel connect to the broader spectrum of adolescent literature, young adult literature? I want us to be able to look at, okay, this is a dystopian novel. It has detective elements in it. What else can we find in it? How can we break this down into something? I want us to look at theme. And like I said before, theme is a complete sentence. It's often an observation. It's not a sermon. Finally, I want to look at theory. I think all of us have had beaten into us. We look for symbols. We look for irony. We look for those literary devices that we dreaded learning about in sophomore high school English class. But there are other ways to look at it. There are other ways to examine a novel. And I want to take a look at some of those and apply some of those as we go through this class. Most importantly, I want us to read and enjoy good novels. And it's a good story, whether we relate to it or not. If it's a well-told story, race and class and culture may be important. But at the same time, I think we all can see ourselves in these stories as we go through them. And I think in the past, I may have been guilty of saying that young adult literature or adolescent literature wasn't a good, high quality literature. But I think we can move from chapter books to young adult literature as an important transition before we read Tolstoy or before we read whatever The Old Man and the Sea or whatever the classic is. And so we're going to look at these as whether or not they constitute good stories. For day one, I think after going over the syllabus, this should wrap it up, and we'll pick it up from there in the next class period.